Greetings, comrades. There is a perception in Western society that Vladimir Putin is seeking to create USSR 2.0. That there is a very strong sense of resentment in Russian society, that people still cannot accept and believe in the fact that seemingly overnight their country went from one of two superpowers to something resembling a developing country. And they want to return to the USSR, to revive it. Obviously, we can't get into Vladimir Putin's head and we can't find out his real feelings about the collapse of the USSR either. But his phrase about this collapse being the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century is quite well known. Today let's talk about the average Russian. How much do they regret the events of 1991 and do they want it all back? In general, the desire to bring back the good old days is a normal human behavior. The grass used to be greener and the ice cream tasted better. Besides, many people associate the USSR with childhood, which is always the most warmly remembered time of our lives. In addition, let's be honest, there were a lot of good things in the Soviet Union, even if we put aside all this rhetoric that we lived in a great country that ruled half the world. Free housing, excellent education, universal healthcare system, no unemployment. With all the obvious shortcomings of the Soviet Union, one cannot but admit that socialism in the USSR was not just in the name. The state really tried to provide the entire population of the country with access to as many social benefits and services as possible. Not all of them, and not always top quality, but the state did try. Let's try to figure out whether Russians today miss the USSR as some kind of semi-mythical country where everything was good, or whether this is a really serious aspiration of the Russian society. 75% of Russians say Soviet era was the greatest time in country's history, poll from 2020. 62% of respondents say that they regret the collapse of the USSR, 2021. 48% of Russians admitted that they would love to see the Soviet Union restored, 2022. It would seem that the numbers speak for themselves. There is indeed a demand in Russian society for a return to Soviet times. Sociological studies from both liberal and official government sources confirm this. Moreover, respondents usually take the era of the 70s, that is, the time of Leonid Brezhnev, which is usually described by the not very flattering epithet era of stagnation, as an example of the ideal Soviet Union. Let's try to figure out how this happened. It is easiest to understand the older generation, especially since they are the most ardent admirers of the Soviet Union. According to the results of the 2021 survey, the citizens aged 46 to 60 years old, 82% regret the collapse of the Soviet Union the most. Among Russians over 60 years old, this percentage is 76%. For comparison, among young people aged 18 to 30, about a quarter of respondents, 28%, regret the collapse of the Soviet state. What is the reason for this attitude towards the USSR? Actually, it is not that everything was so rosy in the Soviet Union, and especially under Brezhnev. It is because of how bad everything became immediately afterwards. The end of the Soviet era was marked by people's general confidence that all problems were the fault of the decaying state, a rotten system of old men which was holding back some incredible potential of Soviet people. Perestroika brought new hopes. People felt that now, when the state would stop restraining them, they would be able to build an even greater country. But they overestimated both themselves and the country. There was a rapid collapse of the Union and painful transformation in the economy, which brought everyone's heads out of the clouds. People enthusiastically rushed into the free market environment, but quickly realized that it was difficult and, most importantly, kinda dangerous. And for some reason, the new Russian state was not in a hurry to help people, but instead was busy trying to keep itself alive. The Soviet man, accustomed to a calm, measured life in the era of developed socialism, was literally shocked by this new permanent state of danger. Human memory is such that one remembers primarily the good things, and people of the generation who actually lived in the USSR now remember that everything seemed to be pretty good in general, but then it became bad. The factory in the city closed down, and the salaries were not paid for 6 months straight, and then they were fired from their jobs, and they were drug addicts and beggars in the street. But there was no such things under the USSR. So we draw the logical conclusion that the collapse of the USSR was a bad thing, and it would have been better if it had not happened. People are not inclined to remember the economic problems of the 1970s or 80s, the international tensions or the excesses of the Soviet Union and its policies. They recall that they did not particularly like Brezhnev in general, but then things got worse, they got Yeltsin. There is also a trivial longing for youth, when economic and social problems seem to be somewhere far away, and you were organizing your personal life, you were getting a degree, you were working somewhere, maybe serving in the army, had a guaranteed salary, and you were confident in your future. Ideology everywhere, well, who really cares? Some have always agreed with it, some have learned to ignore it. Let's return to the same sociological surveys. Among the most common reasons why Russians would like the USSR to be revived, the most popular is life was generally better, easier, simpler, 14% of respondents. Relations between people were better, there was friendship, there was stability, confidence in the future, 7% each. There was unity, cohesion of people, 4%. There were no borders between republics, there was work, there was social security, the state cared about people, 3% each. That is, among these reasons there is no "I like the red flag", "I wish for the establishment of the Communist International", or "I want to show the damned capitalist the Kuzma's mother". Instead, rather simple and understandable desires prevail. Another question is whether these idealized perceptions always correspond to reality. For example, the option "there was unity, solidarity and friendship of peoples of Soviet republics". Perhaps, but then how can we explain the ease with which the Union collapsed when these very peoples were given the opportunity to live separately from each other? For many people, the Soviet era is remembered not as a time of high living standards and prosperity, but as a time of justice. Today, state capitalism is perceived as unfair. Injustice lies in the distribution of wealth, access to goods and infrastructure. Now, this feeling is growing, especially among the older age group, as pensions in Russia are extremely low. And among young people under 30, as leftist ideas of socialism are increasingly finding admirers among these age group, both in the West and in Russia. At the same time, it cannot be said that the Soviet Union was devoid of the problems for which capitalist Russia is now being criticized. A small bunch of oligarchs are hundreds of thousands of times richer than ordinary working people. Yes, but also in the Soviet Union the party elite had much more opportunities than everyone else. Money from the budget flows to Moscow and little is given to the regions. Yes, but older people remember very well how in the years of deficit at the USSR they had to go to Moscow even to buy sausage, which was simply not available in the cities surrounding the capital. So when people dream of reviving the Soviet Union, they either consciously forget about all these drawbacks of life there, or they may simply not know about them if we are talking about the younger generation. They rather listen to the stories of their parents and grandparents about how good it was in their youth. And it's logical that these grandparents will first of all remember delicious ice cream and the feeling of joy from Gagarin's flight into space in their stories, and not the problems with buying women's tights or the charms of life in a communal apartment for 20 people. As a result, many young people perceive the Soviet Union as some kind of fantastic paradise world where everyone was equal and there was justice. They are inspired by stories about happy childhood, the most delicious ice cream for 13 kopecks, pioneer camps, the beaches of the Crimea, Caucasian resorts and friendship between nations, as well as cheap food, stable wages and free apartments. A modern young person who says that he would like to live in the times of the Soviet Union simply does not realize what everyday difficulties which seem incredible now most Soviet citizens had to face at that time. What do you mean there's no meat at the nearest grocery store? Well, I'll go to the store next door. What do you mean they don't? They will have it on Sunday? Maybe. Well, I'll go to buy some oranges. What? Available once a year? Ah, fine, I'll just go and watch the Champions League final on TV. How come it's not on TV? In general, nostalgia is often attributed to Russians as a typical national trait. And indeed, the theme of longing for bygone times is richly represented, for example, in classic Russian literature. This is also reflected in Russians' attitudes toward the country's former leaders. In the 70s and 80s, Leonid Brezhnev was the most popular subject of jokes, sometimes quite offensive ones. But 30-40 years passed and Brezhnev is already considered the best ruler of the 20th century. That's how human memory is. And do not think that this is a purely Russian phenomenon. For example, the populists all over the world are actively playing on the nostalgia of the rapidly aging voters. Campaigners for Brexit promised the return of good old England, Trump promised to make America great again, and right-wing parties throughout Europe promised to bring back the time when migrants were few and could be considered second-class citizens. After all, it was much better before. Not really, but who will check that? I personally consider the 2020 poll to be the most representative here, because its wording seemed to me to be the most effective. Do you agree with the opinion that the Soviet era was the best time in the history of our country, with a high level of welfare and opportunities for ordinary citizens? Definitely agree, and rather agree 75%. However, only 28% of respondents agreed to return to the path of the Soviet Union, while the majority of respondents are in favor of either Russia's own special path, 58%, or the European option of development, 10%. It turns out that if you ask people if they want to live in the Soviet Union, most of them will say, nah, not really, but it was good. It turns out that Russians are generally positive about the Soviet era, but rather in an abstract way. Some regret the loss of the feeling of belonging to a great power, some regret the destruction of the unified economic system, some speak of increased mutual distrust and bitterness. Personal memories of this era are replaced by general ideas about social stability, confidence in the future, and good life in the USSR. And such dark pages of history of the 20th century as famine and repressions are rarely mentioned at all. And even more so, people who lived through them rarely tell their children and grandchildren about these times. As the Russian proverb goes, «Кто старое помянет, тому глаз вон». For most people, the Soviet Union exists only in their childhood or youth memories, stories of parents and grandparents, and Soviet movies, where anything bad was usually not shown. So it turns out that representatives of all generational groups agree with the statement about the socio-economic well-being of citizens in the USSR. And although nostalgia for the Soviet Union is more characteristic for older people, young people also join those who believe that the collapse of the USSR could have been avoided, and consequently the disaster of the 1990s too. However, romanticization of the Soviet past does not lead to an overwhelming desire to restore the Soviet system. Rather, it reflects society's demand for some kind of social change. The common man believes that the state could do more for him personally than it is doing now. These are not fantasies of the past, but dissatisfaction with the present and fear of the future. This does not mean that people dream of returning to an all-powerful party, to the Iron Curtain and to constant control of all spheres of life. Rather, they would like to return to libraries and cinemas in every neighborhood. They would like to know that people from 15 different republics live in relative peace and harmony. They want to feel proud again of the country's achievements in sports, culture, science and space exploration. But deep down we all realize that even the sudden restoration of the USSR will not bring all this. If only because that wonderful Soviet country, which many people remember with such warmth, it is largely imaginary. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Take221, Yelizaveta, Zakharova, Kirill, Klimuk, Simon Böse, Jordan LaMothe, Jimmy Albin, Ilic, Petar, Ilic and Bruce Eternick. See you next time.